Welcome to The Call to Rise, the podcast for sacred rebels, visionaries, and conscious changemakers. Here we sit down with the people birthing the new earth, weaving ancient wisdom with modern strategy to build movements that heal, transform, and uplift our world. I'm Mackenzie Darling, your host, inviting you into honest conversations, practical tools, and hard-won wisdom to awaken your power and to inspire you to answer the call to rise and to meet this moment in history. Today we have Larry, who is the co-founder and board member of Decriminalize Nature, which sprouted from Oakland in 2019. He advocates for the unalienable right to develop one's relationship with nature and aims to support efforts to decriminalize entheogenic plants and fungi at the city level. As of 2024, over 25 cities and countries have decriminalized entheogenic plants and fungi nationwide. Larry is the co-lead for Decrim Nature's national outreach and supports many cities across the USA and internationally who are seeking to propose similar legislation to their local government. He is also helping to support grassroots, community-driven, bottom-up approach to entheogenic healing. From the bottom of my heart, Larry, thank you so much for what you're doing. It's so important coming from being an entheogenic minister myself and holding these sacred plants close to my heart and my own healing. I just really want to thank you for the sacred work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Mackenzie. And it's been quite a pleasure to work with so many people from all over the place and really getting to hear how everyone is, emerging from this world or coming into this world, both people that are brand new to it, but also people that have been doing this for a while and finding ways that we can increase access points so that people can actually participate. And then on the broader scale, as this part of this podcast, helping people to understand how they can participate. And I think a lot of times people feel so overwhelmed with the thing that is out there that we got to sort of struggle with, right? How do you start tapping in? How do you start finding ways that you can actually make change happen? And I think that's sort of a secondary layer of what we do that maybe isn't often talked about, but it often flows in with these big insights that you have from your inner experience. And then how do you actually take advantage or use them in a way that's both healing for yourself and your community and beyond. I think that's been a really joy with Decrim Nature. And I really thank you for having me on the podcast and excited to hear more about your growth as a new organization and a new podcast and, helping to show and train other movement makers out there how to keep engaging, because I think that's such a critical part of this. It's really easy to become apathetic sometimes. And when you can say, wait a second, just knowing that you can make change happen. This is a stat I'm making up right now, but I'll say 50% reduction in apathy, when you can actually see, oh, wow, I'm not just kind of blown by the winds, but I can sort of take a stand here. And given, obviously it's hard work. Everyone that's out there doing movement maker stuff, it's hard work. It's not easy. You got to have your support systems. And even if that support system is just journaling or painting or doing, yelling out into the void or whatever it is, going on a nice hike, watching the sunset, whatever it is, finding ways and access points to actually make real change happen, I think is really considerable in terms of moving things forward and really supporting each other as movement makers because, everyone's doing different things in different areas. And if we can all just take a little piece and work on that ourselves, and we know everyone else is doing that as well, I think that the growth can happen pretty tremendous.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things that you just said in there that I want to dive deep into. But the first is, yes, I mean, it can feel really, really overwhelming, especially when you're working with psychedelic medicines and healing and having these visions of this better earth and tapping into how we can build something that's better for everyone, right? But it can also feel so overwhelming, and you do have that apathy come in because you don't know which step to take first. And so I really love having movement makers like you come onto the podcast and be really part of this mycelial network to help shape and mentor the new activists and the new people that are stepping forward in this time because it's so important. I'd love to start with what was the impetus for you co-founding Decriminalize Nature? And can you tap into, I think one of the most important things when we talk about movement building is honing into your sacred why. Why is this so close to your heart?
Yeah, well, I mean, for everyone that's had I use the term entheogen, you can use psychedelics, sacred plant medicine, ancestral sacred plants, however you want to kind of look at these extraordinary, beings that grow from the ground, which is pretty impressive, right? When you have some of these experiences, you realize, I was talking to somebody about this at San Francisco's 3-year anniversary yesterday. You come to realize that there's so much more. And the first time you realize there's so much more is kind of paradigm shattering. All day long, we're told in sort of the mainstream media, consciousness exists in the brain. You're nothing more than a component of parts. When you're dead, you're done, game over. Do what you can to work in the machine that is society and buy as much things to find your value through that as you can, right? That seems to be the rhetoric out there in terms of like how we are being told to exist in the world. And then you have that first breakthrough experience. And that first breakthrough experience is the realization of like, wow, I'm bigger than that. I'm more connected than that. I'm more powerful than that. I'm somebody that can actually engage in a good way. How do we be in integrity? Like just knowing that there's something beyond that sort of mainstream idea of consciousness is so powerful. And that's kind of what my sacred why, like just the realization of like, wow, I had no idea, and I studied neuroscience when I was an undergrad. So I was doubly, beating the head with like, okay, everything's in the brain. That's all there is, it's just neuronals. It's just, if you want to know about your experience, just go to the fMRI and whatever's lit up, you're good to go, And of course, that does tell us something. I'm not taking away from all that, but it doesn't really tell us about some of these deep, profound, oftentimes, as with your ministry stuff, spiritual experiences. People are having these sacred experiences. They're connecting with, and if we can define spirit as something beyond consciousness for even folks that are more in the secular realm, something that's just beyond our normal understanding of consciousness, that there's a space beyond, transcends time and space, that transcends our normal understanding of things. When you realize that, not only does it take away a little bit of that apathy, but not only does it take away a little bit of our overwhelm, but also then it kind of gives that extra drive, that extra motivation, that sort of the fuel that drives us forward, because as all your movement makers probably know, it's not easy. You're fighting against the system, and the system wants to do everything to spit you up and shoot you out and throw you away. And sometimes it's hard, and sometimes you got to go through stuff that you don't want to go through. And sometimes you have to deal with interpersonal stuff and relational stuff that's going on, even within community and outside of community. And then you have your sort of hardcore, prohibitionists, in this realm, maybe in other realms, there's other things, that people that are really fighting. I have this sort of a side note to have this really great list I'm creating of these policy antagonist archetypes, right? So you have your sort of your prohibitionist mindset, right? That's sort of the standard, like, no, these are it's against the law and we can't do it, right? This kind of goes across the board. Okay, law is law, and people forget, like, wait, all those laws were created by human beings.
Right.
So that shapes policy. Policy shapes life. So we have this sort of magical spell that we put in through bureaucracy that shapes how people get arrested or not, people lose their jobs or not, people have, lose their children or not, what have you, because of these laws that can easily be undone by those same people. Instead of like, oh, this is the same thing that's always been there. Drug laws have only been there since 1970. Of course, there were some, obviously a long history of oppression that's been going on, but in terms of the law, it can be changed one way as easily to criminalize them as it can be to decriminalize them, right? So the idea that we can actually shape society and culture through the words that we write, through policy, I think is pretty impressive. So that part is pretty great. But then so you have your sort of your prohibitionists. Then there's a term I think Jamie Morey out of Boston coined this term, but I really love it. It's the idea of slow abolitionist, which are people who are like, slow down, we need more research. We've been researching this since 9000 BC in terms of humanity. You look at some of these sort of ancient, and I just was talking to somebody yesterday as well, saying the San Pedro cactus sort of tradition has been found in temples all throughout South America up to about 10,000 years ago. So you're looking at two different continents having 9 to 10,000 years of practice around these substances, and yet we're like, no, we need more research. Okay, well, we know at least at the base level, it shouldn't be criminalized because it's not killing anybody and it's not, causing major harm. So that's the slow abolitionist mindset. Then you have your sort of gatekeeper mindset. Well, okay, it's okay for us to do it because we know better, but you, the plebes, no, we have to make sure that you can only go through us, right? And that's sort of his history. Well, unfortunately, this sort of because of the criminalization, you've had these people that are willing to take risks that have become the self-appointed gatekeepers. And so you have the sort of internal community gatekeepers, but you also have your religious entities, you have your government entities, you have your clinical entities, what have you, that are like, only through me, right? Okay, how do we change that mindset? So there's a profiteering mindset, which is looking for how can we sort of profit off of this no matter what. not thinking about the value of the community. And then the one that I think most of the movement makers out there are probably familiar with, yourself as well. And I'm going to say I coined this term. I keep telling everyone, no one's doubted me yet on this, so so I'll just say that I coined it. But this term I'm going to use called status quosis. And status quosis is the psychosis of the status quo, where it's like you're so stuck in a system, you're so stuck in a particular way of thinking, any novel idea, any sort of new thought that comes in, and you can almost see it in the individual you're speaking with, especially in terms of this type of policy, or for other people that are coming up with radical ideas. They're talking to somebody that would be sort of more normal speaking, or mainstream ideas. You almost see like a short circuit that happens. Like you start saying something, and the person that you're talking to leaves, and this other being, this other protector or whatever comes through, that you can't destroy my idea of the status quo. That makes me unstable, so therefore I'm gonna like fight you. And then all of a sudden you see somebody that you've never seen before in front of you that might be a good friend, and all of a sudden they're coming at you and being like, who's this person, right? So I also call it the Agent Smith complex for those people out there that have seen Matrix, where this Agent Smith character, this programmable character, will just pop up wherever because they're trying to protect the whole systems. So how do we start to understand that if we think on systems thinking, that there's a lot of leverage points, there's a lot of ways and avenues to work that system so it's not so structured. So there's a little bit of looseness to it. And that's where movement can happen. That's where change can happen. You can start sort of dialing up, okay, we need more communication valve here. Let's throw the communication over here. We need to talk to this person who's a strong prohibitionist, get them to lighten up. How do we see what's going on out there as a large system, and then utilize the points and leverage points that we can in all of our different ways, from all of us working at the same time? Because I think we're all kind of going after the same general system, to start to sort of, take out the screw here, take a gear out over here, do whatever we can, so that all of a sudden the system is not able to function in the way that it normally is. And then, of course, you don't want to create a vacuum, because as I say, anytime you create a power vacuum, sometimes the next thing in line is even worse. So continuing to build that infrastructure locally to support that vacuum potentially as the system sort of breaks apart. Well, I think, to rewind back, now that I've been speaking for 10 minutes, rewind back to your previous question, which was basically, that was the sacred why. Now, what's going on with Decrim Nature? This has been sort of a long history of work for myself and a variety of other people. I have been thinking about the same sort of thing, more establishing sort of base groundwork, base education, base support systems through another organization, Entheogenic Research Integration Education, that we created in 2011. That's been working on some integration circles and doing education. We've also trained people all over the U.S. around this. We're actually going to be putting out some workshops coming up in the near future once we find a space to kind of start doing that, which is exciting. But that's sort of the establish that base level, right? And then from there, we all came together in a meeting in Oakland, and we had a group of changemakers in the room. And sometimes that's what it takes, is you just have the right people in the room with the openness to even start discussing something like this. It was like kind of like all the stars aligned at that moment in time. It could have been any one of us that day was like, oh, actually, this isn't a good idea. And then, sort of shot it down, and then nothing would have happened.
Larry, just to break this apart for our listeners, can you even go a little bit slower of how did you get all of those change makers into the same room?
Yeah, so nothing really too magical there. It was just basically we were looking to build a conscious community center, and we were sort of looking at this new space in Oakland, and the space owner was like, hey, let's meet on next Sunday. We had all met at an event that I was hosting with Bob Otis and a couple other people on sort of plants and ministry, or that type of thing, at Terrace Temple was called at the time. And we met there, started a conversation. We came to this next event, or sort of meeting. So Bob brought a couple of folks from his community, so he kind of had that sort of ministry and other sort of technical background. There was a surgeon there, as Dr. Surgeon, that was there. There were a couple sort of community members that were there. Practitioner was there. Myself, who had done a lot of research around, obviously, this work. I was working on my dissertation as well, and a few other folks. We just happened to be all there in the room at the same time, so nothing really special happened. And I think that's why you say sort of the stars align, all of a sudden it comes down to where, just the right people just are in the right spot without any sort of news or expectation. In fact, we didn't go there to talk about decriminalization. We went there to talk about a conscious community center. And in the process of talking about that, we were like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could also incorporate in these plant medicines, these sacred plant medicines, into this? If we're talking about conscious community center, it seems like that's a natural. And we all had kind of known each other through that part of the community, all the different people in that room. So then we started talking about Denver, Colorado, and Oregon. This was in 2019, like late 2018 when we first met. And that was before, I don't know if your viewers or listeners are familiar with kind of the sort of the beginning stages of some of the decrim that's been going on in the US. But Denver, Colorado have been talking about passing a ballot initiative. Oregon was talking about passing a ballot initiative. Denver was talking about decrim of mushrooms, or psilocybin, I guess they were calling it. And Oregon was talking about a legalization framework, and then also maybe some decrim, but they were kind of doing this dual model, which we can talk about later if we want to, but that kind of fell apart and isn't as successful as sort of we were pitched at the beginning, unfortunately. But as we were talking about that, we were saying, hey, let's figure out a way to do something similar. So we started talking about what's the difference between decriminalization and legalization. Can we do more than just mushrooms? And this is another thing I would highly recommend for all of your change makers out there, all your movement makers. Don't listen to the polls. The polls are relying upon old information. And if you're a good movement maker, you're constantly educated. And so if you do a poll before people are educated, of course the poll is going to say that people don't know about this thing. It's all about how you present it. So, and oftentimes polling, you can have somebody who has different agenda that are asking the polling questions. And if you don't see what the polling questions are, you might look at it and say, oh, these results show this thing, but you don't realize that the questions themselves were contaminated, for example, with multiple variables.
Interesting.
One question, which is very simple. I saw this in a California poll that happened a little while ago. Do you agree with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? And that's one variable, right? Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So a lot of people said yes on that, right? They said, oh, well, look, according to the polling, decrim is much lower than the legalization framework, right? The decrim question said, do you agree that people 18 years or older should be able to grow, gather, gift these 4 different substances for this thing at this time, blah, 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 20 different variables. I might agree with everything, but not the 18 and over. Or I might think this thing or not that thing. So like, how do you actually know in a polling question, what exactly are people, if it's not very specific in one item at a time, you're going to get skewed results. And then of course the people oftentimes that are paying for those polls are deep pockets. And of course they want to, and then back to the gatekeeping idea, they want to hold control over it. So they say, look, the poll said this, so therefore we're going to do it this way, and never really pay attention to the power of the grassroots. And the power of the grassroots is connection, community, education, bringing people together, showing the power of the city council meetings, that type of things. So anyway, long sidetrack to say, so there's a lot of things going on out there that we were kind of aware of. Denver folks told us, we did the polling and nobody knows what these other plants are that you're talking about. Just do mushrooms. And so we said, we're in the Bay Area. We know for sure that there's an ayahuasca community here, an ibogaine community out here, a DMT community, a cacti community, a mushroom community. Why are we going to separate everyone out? Let's have a conversation around nature. And so we really started to sort of strategize that in this meeting, and then, next meetings to call our organization Decriminalize Nature, to change the conversation around plants and mushrooms. So it wasn't easy for a detractor to say, we're just trying to get high, but ask this deeper layer question. What is our relationship with nature? Who has the authority to criminalize nature? Who has the authority to tell you you can't grow something out of the ground? Who has the authority to call you a criminal if you accidentally have some mushrooms growing on your ground you don't have anything to do with? Like all these types of things. So it forces a new conversation, and just the name itself stops people in their tracks. So again, if we're talking about how do we address status quosis or the Agent Smith complex, sometimes you throw something in there that kind of puts something in the gears that doesn't let them to have their natural thinking mode, where they just go bop, 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 bop. Now you stop that sort of mode, and you sort of made them pause for a second and think, and that's what we need to do, right? So again, for your movement makers out there I know it's a little bit marketing, finding those catchy, insightful, short ideas that are packageable without being too kitschy or sort of cliche or any of that kind of thing, but to have it be something that can really make people think, again, is a really powerful thing. That's one thing we do have to do for sure. And I know probably everybody out there has a varying amount of opinions around marketing in general and how that can be used for good or bad. And was propaganda, was it good propaganda if we're doing it, but bad propaganda, but the words are spells, everyone knows that, right? And so you choosing the right words, choosing the right sort of ideas, finding the terms that can really support what you're talking about as a movement, but also letting sure that the other person isn't scared of it, because it's a two-way conversation that's happening. You're talking about your movement, but you're also having it being received by somebody who's in that sort of status quo mindset. And so to make it digestible for them, or something that they can ask a question about instead of immediately turning it off. So even using the word entheogen instead of psychedelic. Psychedelic, for the detractors, that's an easy turnoff word. It forces them to say, what does that mean? I don't know what that term means. Okay, well, now we can describe something new, right? And we start fresh, which is great. So back to the story in Oakland again. We all came together. We started having these conversations. They're much deeper than we were hearing out there in terms of the policy stuff. And I think it resonated with a lot of folks, especially in the Bay Area. We started talking to the city council members. That process was really amazing, just kind of knowing, mystifying that process. For a lot of people out there, self included, previous this meeting and this process, I had never stepped foot into a city council office. And so for those out there who think, oh, I've never done this before, I'm not a political activist, of course you are. Of course you are. You know, you just got to do it. You just got to get in there. You got to make a few mistakes and get the hang of it. And that's always part of the process too. You've got to make some mistakes, you know, you're going to realize like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have said that to that person, but I'm learning how this is received or how
Won't do that again.
Exactly. But, you know, in the process, you're really learning. And now what I'm learning is that, you know, I like to say bureaucracy is the AI of humanity. Once you get the template, whether it's here in California or in Maine or in Massachusetts or in Florida or Michigan, you might have different characters at play, you know, maybe more archetypes on the prohibitionist side versus ones that you can talk with. But it's the same system, the same templates, the same talk to this person who'd say this thing, go to this person to ask for this thing, pitch it in this way, all that kind of things. So we started pitching it here. We were really lucky to have a wonderful council member to start us off, Council Member Nolgayo, who's sort of sponsored the resolution and put it on the table. He comes from Yaqui tradition, so he has a long peyote tradition. He said his grandmother was a curandera, so he's very familiar with sort of the healing potentials of plants and mushrooms. He probably was focusing a little bit more on the medicinal side of things outside of the sort of psychoactive ones, but still very aware of these for the potential in a lot of different areas. He sort of helped us along. It was great too because he was sort of center of the aisle. Also something that's really important for the movement makers out there, especially if you're doing city level stuff or any kind of legislative stuff. You might find you have a really big ally, but they're way on one side of the aisle, and that's going to alienate other folks. So you might want to say, okay, thank you for supporting us. Please be our co-sponsor. But we're also looking for someone in the center, someone that's a little bit more moderate, because a lot of times you're going to have to deal with people on both sides of the aisle. Or even like where you have a really progressive and central progressive, sometimes the far progressive still alienates the central progressive to some degree or back and forth. And then you find in situations where it's like, okay, we have all the super progressives, but if we, you know, put that out to the public, then the central progressives will feel like hesitant to also want to put their name on it until we have a larger sort of conversation. And that's happened in one or two cities out there as well. So I'm sort of peppering in some hints throughout all this.
Please, it's so helpful.
Trying to make this stuff happen on your local level. So, but yeah, once you have the resolution, you know, that also is really helpful. Learn how to write a resolution. For anyone that's out there that wants to do this, we do a monthly orientation. Even if you're not talking about psychedelics or entheogens, you just want to learn the process of passing something on city council. Check us out on the last Wednesday of the month. We do this at 3 p.m. Pacific. I can contact us at decriminalizenature.org. Small little plug there, but you know, it basically just helps you understand the system. It's a bit of an info dump. It's, you know, an hour and a half of information, and I talk fast, as you can probably tell. So there's
so much good info.
A lot of note taking for sure, but we send you all that information afterwards, and then we kind of help you along in the process after that. But that kind of just like takes you through the, okay, you know, who is our city council? A lot of people don't even know, who did I even vote for? Who's representing my district? Never even heard this person before. Who are the people that are in charge of law enforcement or public safety? Do they prefer using the term public safety instead of law enforcement? Another thing that's a minor detail, but like one of those things that makes a big difference in terms of trying to build relationships with folks, right? Who is the city manager? Is the city manager strong, or is the mayor strong? Sometimes the city manager does a lot of the directions of the protocol, and other times it's the mayor. So get those sort of details aligned. Understand who your city council is. Start researching them a little bit. And something that's super easy that anyone can do tomorrow or whenever your next city council meeting is just sit in a city council meeting. You know, sometimes people are they you know, don't want to go on a budget day, you know, because that is going to be tedious, and you're going to be like, I'm never going to a city council meeting again. But sit in one that, you know, maybe they're just talking about whatever, get some familiarity with the place, you get certain understanding of the rhythm, you get, you know, sort of demystify the power dynamic that's at play there. And you're like, oh wait, These are just people that are also in our community. They're not someone that I have to be worried about or fretting about, what have you. So that whole process was really great in terms of learning here. We ended up having a pre-event rally. Again, we're in the Bay Area, so it wasn't surprising. We had like about 180 people show up to that pre-rally, and then we sort of galvanized everyone, start sending out emails and that type of thing. Past here had 2 different days that it went to city council. The first day there was 100 people, I think, that were giving testimony. I think, were you there on one of the 2 days? I think, Mackenzie, no?
I wasn't.
Okay. Well, 100 people showed up on that day. We only had invited 20. So we're like uncertain. Are these other 80 people going to be against this idea? And everyone was supportive and positive, which was great. The city council, of course, was looking at this line that trailed around the city council room. And they were saying, okay, each of these is 2 minutes. This is going to be a long night. Yeah, until it's on the next one. We don't need so many people, but still 30 people wanted to share. Another, I think, unique thing about Oakland, and maybe you'll see this in your towns or cities out there as well, is the openness of the city to listen to their constituents. Mm-hmm. Oakland has a really, really nice, large city council room. A lot of seats in the floor, balcony with seats as well. It's almost encouraging conversation from their constituents. That's amazing. A really great feeling. You go to some place like San Francisco, very ornate, very beautiful. Everyone likes to take their weddings in the city hall because it's so fancy and beautiful. You get in the city hall meeting, and maybe you can fit 50 or 75 people if you're cramming them in there. And of course, you can say, well, maybe this is because, architecture from ancient past, et cetera, and blah, 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 right? But you can definitely see that there's a bit of a difference in terms of how the community voice is heard and held in these certain positions, in these certain offices. So if you're in a city, definitely that's also another good thing about going and sitting in a city council room, is you just get a sense of like, how open are they going to be to hearing what we have to say? And so, but, at the end of the day, that's their job. Another thing I always tell people that they forget is that these folks work for you.
Isn't that true?
Are your employees. Tell them what you want. Share with your community. Come out there. Don't be afraid. And nowadays too, especially with, COVID and the pandemic and everything got locked down and everything like that, just even going into an office kind of blows their mind right now. Because everyone got so used to not coming in anymore that they're just like, it's crickets in the office. So as probably many folks know out there, the term lobbying comes from sitting in the lobby and waiting until they basically either get you a bunch of meetings or they kick you out.
I didn't know that, actually.
Lobbying is just sitting in the lobby and waiting. And eventually the secretary there is going to be like, all right, these people aren't leaving. We got to start getting some meetings set up. Otherwise, we're going to have them in here all day, which of course they don't want because, it's just, more pressure on their side. So, even doing something like that, going in person, makes a big difference. Phone calls make a big difference. Emails, they're okay, but it's easy to dismiss an email. A phone call, an in-person conversation, some places a handwritten letter can be really helpful. Although we did hear from a recent mayor that, maybe those are less well received than not. I think in California, I could be wrong about this, but there's something about, if they get a handwritten letter, they have to write a handwritten letter back or some sort of letter back to you and send it to you. So it's probably
I can imagine.
Tedious, like, another handwritten letter, right? But then they got to at least deal with it. They have to look at it and they have to like address it versus just dismissing it. But phone calls and in-person stuff is going to be the best way to build that relationship because they can see you in front of you. You can have a real conversation with them. You can see them. You can kind of, it's probably everyone knows it's a movement maker. A lot of it is talking to the person that's in front of you, meeting them where they're at, feeling them, seeing how their micro, facial expressions and, comfortability or not uncomfortability or whatever that happens when you're in a person-to-person kind of conversation, that you can really get a sense of like how best to share the information that you want to share with them to make the change or make the movement that you want to make. I think that pretty much answered your question.
I want to pause for a quick moment. If what we're talking about today resonates with you, you'll want to check out the Movement Maker Incubator, my 6-month intensive where I guide sacred rebels and changemakers to birth their own movements using ancient wisdom and modern strategy. You can join the waitlist and learn more about this sacred rite of passage for changemakers at globalmovementmaker.com/incubator. I mean, so much to chew off there. I'm already loving just listening to you and having all of this incredible information. Thank you so much. I love how we just ended that on the importance of relationships. And when we're building movements, I think it really does come down to being able to inspire your communities and your constituents to believe in what you're trying to put out there and the power of relationship. And so I'd love for you to unpack a little bit more of how you have handled relationships within your movement. How have you inspired people to open up their own chapters of Decriminalize Nature? And then I'd love to switch the conversation around what are some best practices around volunteering?
Okay, yeah, that's the $1 million question, that second one.
It sure is. It
Everyone
is.
out there is struggling with it. Hey, relationship building is important. We are lucky in our movement because the relationship's already been built. And that relationship has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the plant medicine, the sacred materials that they're already experiencing, the spirituality, the consciousness. Everyone, even from, you see sometimes these communities come together in these different cities and like they're as different from each other as you can possibly think. And yet they have this single thread between all of them, which is this deeper inner experience. And this could be the case with every movement, but I think there's something definitely unique about this where, people are knowing it on this sort of visceral soul level, how important this is, and also feel the injustice of that. We can get arrested for something as beautiful as connecting to ourselves, to our souls, to consciousness. So on that side of things, we are a little bit lucky or skewed, I guess, than maybe the general movement maker who still does have to do a lot of work in terms of building that conversation so that people feel that deep sort of connection to the topic at hand.
Something that I keep running into with movement makers, though, is, and you've alluded to this a couple times, is the importance of education. So, while you are having people and meeting people that have had these incredible experiences, you're also having to educate people that may not have on these in the council, right? And so
Yeah,
there's a big part of education here.
education is so important for sure. The challenging thing about education is, to use the cliche, the horse and the drink and the water and all that kind of thing, right? You can have all the education. I heard somebody quoted, there's 190 educational organizations out there, and yet still people are like, we need more education. It's like, okay, we're kind of both saturated in education and empty at the same
Yeah.
time. And maybe that has something to do with, again, this sort of weird social media escape where there's so much of it that it just kind of like disappears. I'm not really sure how that works. So sometimes
It
you have.
feels like it's the knowledge age, but not much embodied wisdom whatsoever.
Right, yeah. And I did hear it from somebody says we're in kind of like an information desert and
Right.
everything is online now. And if, I don't know, some Carrington event happens, I don't know, the Carrington event is some like solar flare that like fries all like the technology that's out there. What happens with all of our information? Nobody's been writing anything down. Like I have tons of stuff written and recorded that I haven't put on paper. And if something big happens, EMP, who knows what, a million different things could possibly happen, then we'd be stuck back in the like, how do we do those things again? Because we're so used to like, I can just check it online. And you learn a lot that way. But like the law, the spider and the spider web. The spider is known now. Recently, they've discovered that it keeps all of its information external on the web. So that means it doesn't have to remember so much anymore. So that's what we've kind of,
Really?
yeah, with this, like it does little like designs on the web to, again, I don't know what type of information they're gathering, but in terms of how big is the area, what worked well versus what didn't work well. So there's little bits and pieces of information that it doesn't have to remember. It can just sort of take notes on the web, and then you can go back and actually kind of review it again. So that's what we've been doing as a culture, taking notes on literally the web. And now we actually have, a scenario where maybe we don't remember as much because we're not engaging in it, or we're not, putting it in the sort of the memory banks. We're just like, okay, I know that's stored somewhere else and I can get to it eventually. So education is important, but definitely, I think the finding a way to get the education in front of people that don't know about it is critical. Now, of course, when you have people in the bubble, that's going to be your best educational opportunity. Those are going to be the people that are going to help the people that you're going to come in contact with later who need that direct one-on-one education. But for scenarios, and this comment came up to me not too long ago where this woman I was speaking with, an elder woman, was like, I went to a party when I was like 18 years old, and I didn't know anything about anything, and I went to a party and they puddled me with LSD, and puddled means like enough liquid on there so that it's a noticeable puddle, which is a significant amount of LSD, and then she took it and had a sort of really intense experience, didn't know what to do, and didn't have the education prior, but she didn't even know she needed the education prior. So like those are the people we need to get the education to. the
Right.
people that don't even know that they need the education.
Right. Harm reduction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I know you probably harm reduction, yes, and maybe in this scenario, risk reduction maybe is also another term. I don't know if you use that at all for the folks out there in any kind of movement that you're in. Harm sort of assumes that there's an inherent harm. Risk says, hey, there's risk, and I talked about this in the last couple of talks. One of our original co-founders would always say that there's risk to everything, and actually more people have died taking selfies than all these substances combined. Or sports. People go and do, extreme sports all the time. Those aren't arrested.
And not to mention alcohol, which is just,
Right.
everywhere in our
Yeah.
culture.
But for some reason in our culture, maybe because it's the alcohol industry has done such a good job with their propaganda, that's one of those status quosis moments. If you call out
100%.
alcohol, then all of a sudden you see that short circuit in that individual who's like, no, 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 well, this is okay because no, never mind prohibition that happened in the past, which also legalized this, and we saw how much of a mess that was, then blah 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 blah. But they also have this like weird need to defend alcohol sometimes, despite the fact that it's the number one, harmer in a variety of different realms. Anyway, so finding a way to get education to folks, finding a way to use propaganda and integrity, integrity. Can we find a word to put those two together? So something
Yep.
that's, sharing this education, this information that's truthful, that's honest, that's, kind of speaking to all sides of the story, but also is something that people can absorb, and it's not too deep. It's not too sort of out of their circle, but finding ways to get it to people that are totally new to this. We put the DARE program in schools. That didn't help anybody, but it was mandated to be in schools. I'm not a big mandate person. I think people should be able to have the free choice to choose it or not, but man, it would certainly have helped this elder woman I was speaking to and other folks as well if they even just had a smidgen of understanding about what are these substances, what could be possibly happening, what should I know about dosing, what should I know about this inner experience. And it's hard to talk about the inner experience even because, again, from the very get-go, society has said, everything is in your brain. So even just saying that there's something more to that is already kind of blowing people's minds and hard for people to grok if they're not sort of at least familiar with that. So education's a tricky one. We're always trying to do education, but finding ways to present education to elected officials and other people that are in positions of authority that takes into context of the things that they find relevant. One thing that's nice about a lot of this research is that there's so many ways that we can talk about it. We can talk about it from a spiritual growth perspective, personal healing perspective. We can talk about it for, substance use issues, for end of life anxiety, which is this weird medical spiritual condition that's being treated there, which I think is an interesting sort of merging of these two sort of oppositional sides of the paradigm, so to speak. And then you have obviously a lot of work on depression and other things like that that are being shown. But we try not to lean too hard into the science because of all the challenges that come with the methodologies and the designs. So when we educate people, we also talk about human rights and who has the authority to tell you what you can put in your body, and why are we limiting the appropriate states of consciousness. Graham Hancock talks about this a lot. Why are we saying that the alcohol consciousness is okay, but the psychedelic consciousness, the coffee consciousness is okay, the sugar consciousness is okay, the sex and laughter consciousnesses are okay, maybe less on those ones, but yet these plants and mushrooms that grow out of the ground are not. And that's not even getting into the area of bakes, powders, clear liquids, kind of a no-go in terms of that's an area of education that we still haven't figured out really how to crack the nut because there's so much stigma around it for regular city council members. So we focus on plants and mushrooms because those are digestible, they're not so threatening, sort of it's an incremental step, which some of the hardcore folks are not really for the incrementalism, but it's working. And
Sometimes you have to play that game.
more success in the last 6 years than these hardcore policy organizations have had for the last 30 years. And I think in the long run, it's helping them have bigger conversation around why are we wasting our resources on something that's not a criminal issue, but a public health issue. So education comes into play. Within that education is that relationship building, like knowing that person in front of you, knowing how to sort of talk to them, knowing what type of education they want to hear, sometimes just having a conversation with them so you can learn more about them, so you can figure out the right pitch. Maybe it's not pitching the whole time, and I hate to use that word, but that kind of is what it's like sometimes, but maybe it's just learning about the person enough so that you can be like, oh, okay, listening in, understanding. There's a city council's chief of staff that we had met in Oakland, and we're all kind of doing our little, individual sort of conversations. There were about 6 of us in the room. And the last gentleman that was there was an elder gentleman, and he started talking about end of life anxiety work and how this can be helpful. And he's getting up there in age. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if he could have this experience for end of life anxiety. And all of a sudden we looked at the chief of staff and tears streaming down her face because her husband had just passed a couple months ago. And she was,
Wow.
if he had this, it would have been so important. just really helped him out so much, helped me out, and helped his family out. So sometimes you don't know what conversation is going to, touch somebody in a deep way, but especially with entheogenic plants and mushrooms, there's just a lot of ways that we can kind of speak to it. So that's some relationship building. The volunteering part is tricky. That's an up and down thing. Also relationships, that's more kind of like city council. You'll find with the volunteering with the different cities for the other movement makers out there. Probably in the top five of things that I do is trying to heal interpersonal conflict within certain groups, or disagreements, not conflict. I think that's too strong a word, but disagreements, or I want to go this direction versus this direction. And just remember to stay true to your core, to stay true to your essence. What is the organization? What are the ethos that we agreed upon? Let's start a rally around that and that sort of thing. But, getting volunteers to be excited, sometimes it's going there. And if we had more, fundraising, that would be something I would be trying to do, is try to hit each of these cities individually, going to the space, having an event, showing them in person what it's like to talk to a city council member. I've now talked to so many city council members at this point in time that, not to say I'm patting myself on the back, but, you just learn what the questions are. Like everyone's asking.
You know what you're doing.
Well, it's okay. It's going to be one of these 20 questions more than likely if somebody has a detractor thing. And once you've answered them so many times and hear people's responses, you just have a good sense of it. And of course, again, this comes back to the relationship building and all that kind of, and seeing the person in front of you. But hearing that from other members of the community or the other teams out there, they can get a sense of like, okay, I'm watching now somebody say these words and how that's being reflected on or being responded to, and it seems to work. So then I incorporate that into my sort of understanding of this and how I would now practice with others. And so that's another thing I tell people a lot of times is, because we're talking about the status quosis or the Agent Smith complex, doesn't matter if it's a city council member or somebody that's just, in the grocery store line, or you're sitting next to on the airplane, or, you're down the street at the cafe, the barista, a bartender, who knows, any of the millions of people you could be talking on day to day. Those are all informal conversations. And so, the sort of number one question people always ask, at least here in the US, which is like, what do you do? What do you do for a living? And I got tired of just saying psychology, So I said, well, I'm, doing my dissertation, ayahuasca experiences. And they're like, what is that? Right. So now I had the opportunity to explore what that is and really sort of take that chance. Because it's informal, there's no pressure. This person could say you're the worst and walk away and no sweat off my back, right? So, but I learn how to sort of speak to everybody. So whether your movement is this, whether your movement is something else, practice it in really informal places that you wouldn't really expect to be, even worrying, just, try and avoid the city council members until you're sort of got your feet wet enough that you can kind of go in there with some real sort of strength. But, there's always an opportunity to practice. And just like with anything else, it makes perfect, or practice makes good enough, And so that would be one thing I would say in terms of, the volunteers getting their education together, getting their pitch ready to go. And then as a volunteer group, just know that there's going to be ups and downs and bumps and all that kind of thing. And, if you're really serious about making this happen and making movement happen and making change happen, you got to come together as a community and figure out. And so maybe even come up with some ways to deal with conflict in the community, having some sort of person who can be a mediator or a moderator for any kind of conversations that are difficult. We try to avoid getting too involved with the little bits and pieces of that kind of conversation, but sometimes good moderation can be helpful just to let everyone know, hey, this is what I'm thinking, or this is what I'm thinking. Here's the conflicts come into play. But that would be a good sort of thing for each team kind of to really have out there for your movements, is really to find somebody that can help out with moderation. And not be afraid of conversation. Unfortunately, we're in a world right now where so much is polarized that even just having a conversation is like, I couldn't possibly have a conversation with that person because they're the devil. Like, yes, it's true. Maybe you're right. At the same time, how are we going to move forward?
Right.
The more and more we do that, the more and more we polarize. And then there's this big gap where things can get done that everyone's just letting flail around, loose ends everywhere. And like, if somebody was just to pick up a few of those loose ends, we can get some more progress to happen. So coming together, feeling okay with big conflicting conversations and sitting down with somebody and knowing it's going to be intense or tough sometimes. And you just got to kind of like share your point of view and realize that we're all human beings.
Every episode of the Call to Rise podcast is about the changemakers and movements reshaping our world. But the podcast is just the beginning. On my Substack, I open the door wider. sharing my personal journey with movement makers, the wins, the struggles, and the behind the scenes rituals that help leaders birth what's next. If you're ready to go deeper into the frameworks and practices you hear me hint at here, join me at globalmovementmaker.substack.com. Yeah, movements are a messy process, but they really are huge in transformation. And we have, a lot to benefit from them. And I really love that you brought in the conflict resolution, because you can't build a movement and you can't challenge the status quo and you can't build community without coming together and having some conflict and being able to have the hard conversations.
Right.
Yeah. I'd love to chat a little bit about, you had mentioned fundraising, and do you have any best practices around that for the movement makers out there?
I'm, def I'm definitely the wrong person to ask for that. We've been,
Okay.
always kind of, you find ways to do, we've also put ourselves in that position, maybe unnecessarily, because we really want to say grassroots, no strings attached type of donations are what we're sort of looking for. Yes, there's, the unfortunate circumstance of the nonprofit world is, while you try and avoid capitalism at its essence, or the late stage capitalism toxicity that we hear about all the time, what happens in a nonprofit world, you got to talk to the absolute winners of capitalism.
Right.
Donors, right? So
Yeah.
you're like, damn, all right, I thought we were getting out of this, and now I got to go schmooze with these folks that are maybe like not really, have the best interests in mind, or have their other agendas or whatever else. So, but I was just talking to somebody the other day. There's like the billionaires, and there's the grassroots, and there's a big chunk of folks in the middle that care. And I think that's what, we and other groups really started thinking about, is like, where are the people that, $1,000 donation here, $1,000 donation there is not a lot for folks that are, in that sort of middle strata, so to speak, and can make a big deal for our movement. So that would be one thing I would say, is start to like tap into these networks that aren't really your typical networks. In the psychedelic community, you look at any sort of fundraising page, it's the same 10 people over and over again. Everyone's fighting over the same 10 people. Of course, they all have a lot of money to do that, but now you got to say, well, there's a conflict of interest. If this person donates to this person, blah, blah, blah. Out of those 10 people, outside of those 10 people, there's, 8 million people had a psychedelic experience in 2023. Oh, there's 7,999,999 people we could talk with. And maybe each one's $5. Great. That's 35 grand, or 35 mil, I should say, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever, we can kind of get those smaller donations. That's not always easy either, but, so that's one way to go about doing it. I think doing in events is really great, having a personal touch. We're kind of stuck on social media sometimes, and sometimes people see this sort of veneer of marketing, but don't know the people behind it. So, for example, even just having that event we had in San Francisco, for your audience out there, we had a Decriminalize Nature San Francisco 3-year anniversary. It's a beautiful event in Golden Gate Park. There's this, big trees and a little bit of mist coming through everything, and this beautiful medicine music, and really able to talk to the community in that kind of way, I think makes a big difference in terms of helping people realize, like, oh wait, these are folks that I really want to help out, because they have integrity, and they're grounded, and they're trying to make this difficult thing happen. So like making those connections as much as possible is good. But like I say, we're not definitely successful in our in our fundraising. It's always a struggle. Sometimes we sell t-shirts, sometimes we do other things, we try and do some tabling here and there. We try and make sure that we can be at events, and then get a lot of sort of donated events, so to speak, that we can go to, where people are like taking care of us, or whatever else. But that's a nut that I think everyone out there is trying to crack, and especially when it comes to movement makers, because you're stuck in between a rock and a hard place, which is, if I take money from this big donor, does this dismiss my movement? Does this contaminate what I'm doing? Are there going to be strings attached that I have to make a decision I don't want to make further down the line? One hint I would say to that, I've seen this happen in the past, is that if donors try and give you a sponsorship donation, they give you different types of donations. One of them could be a sponsorship. Sponsorship means that you now have to, sort of quote, sponsor the organization. So you got to say positive things about the organization or whatever else. There's another element which is called contributions. Contributions is more no strings attached. So keep that in mind for everyone out there. Make sure you see what type of donation the big donors are trying to give to you. And make sure that you sort of advocate for the one that's going to give you the most freedom to do your movement, and stick with your own personal advocacy and your own personal ethos, and not get sort of swept up or swept away by somebody who wants to co-opt your movement through a lot of money, that type of thing. So just another sort of thing to consider. But again, like I say, there are a lot of people out there, and I'm hoping that there are well-meaning philanthropists out there who understand now, especially that we've seen, at least, speaking more sort of specifically around the sort of anti-eugenic movement. Now that we've seen how the legalization framework is very expensive and unfortunately doesn't work so well for folks and can be problematic in a lot of different ways, and that decrim at the end of the day, statewide decrim in Colorado and all the cities, I think 10 million people now live in a decrimmed area, is some of the best policy that's out there. And
Yep.
so now I think that people can see through this history of this evidence. Before it was like, oh, you guys are just trying to upend the apple cart and making it difficult for us. And why don't you like our policy? And now we can say, well, here's why. Here's all the reasons that it's problematic. Here's the challenges that come with the regulatory framework. Not that we're saying that things shouldn't be regulated, but when you get the government and mandates and everyone wants to get their finger on it and a piece of the pie, next thing you know, in Oregon, for example, $3,000 to $5,000 for a single experience, and you get a felony for picking a mushroom out of the ground. So that's problematic, right? So
really problematic.
Yeah, finding ways to make sure that, the work that you're doing, having consistency and longevity also helps with that. Had we stopped 2 or 3 years ago, there would have been no like, hey, look, we can point to this as an example now. Now there's enough evidence out there to show that this model is really helpful for folks that it's hard to deny it.
Oh, thank you so much, Larry. I mean, you really have provided such rich information for myself and the listeners out there. I'd love for you to share ways that people can get involved with Decrim Nature.
Sure, yeah. So we have cities that have been activated all over the U.S., which is great. It's fun to watch from the bird's eye view sometimes of the ebb and flow nationwide. Why is it that this particular area all of a sudden turns on and 10 people from that area will contact me at the same time or within 2 weeks? Like, what, did a movie go through that community? Somebody read a book? Is, some bookstore put a book on the shelf that everyone kind of turned? Who knows why it happens in the morphogenetic field? If you want to get into more of the woo with Rupert Sheldrake, which is like, we embed our intentions into the ether, so to speak, and then other people walking through that can pick up on it. Who knows why, but that's a very interesting thing. So no matter where you are, even if you feel like, oh, this is a progressive leaning issue, it's not. It really transcends politics. We have a lot of teams right now. As an example, there's a whole contingency that's starting in Kansas, Missouri, Northwest Arkansas, places like that. So, Florida teams that are going. We have some Georgia teams. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on in the Great Lakes region, in the Northeast as well, and of course the West Coast. Kind of used to that. So it's not surprising for folks there. And of course, we're working on that little strip. We still got no teams that have reached out from Wyoming or North Dakota, but we got some Idaho people reached out recently. So if you're in Wyoming or North Dakota, get something going there too.
Yeah, give Larry a call.
Right. Sometimes it's as simple as like some people are pushing policy. Some people are just laying the groundwork with that education you're speaking about, doing events, doing integration circles, talking to their community, putting a book up on the bookshelf. Maybe you can take that book from the psychedelic section and put it on the top picks or something like that in your book, or, a little sort of guerrilla marketing, if you will. But yeah, if you want to contact us, for a variety of reasons, our website is decriminalizenature.org, or you can find us on Meta platforms at Decriminalize Nature. We're also on Twitter at Decrim Nature, or X, I guess is now, and also sort of, I think, LinkedIn, but we don't do much on LinkedIn because it's also sort of a weird experience. Remember 5 years ago when no one wanted to talk about psychedelics in LinkedIn, and now it's like you can't like scroll down. It's like psychedelics.
It's wild. We're definitely making progress here, Larry, and you're such a big part of that. So thank you again, Larry Norris, everyone. He's a legend. I'm so grateful to just have you in my life as a friend and a fellow Bay Area badass. So thank you so much, and keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to The Call to Rise. If today's conversation stirred something in you, subscribe and share it with a fellow movement maker. And join our community at globalmovementmaker.com. Till next time, keep leading with courage, keep weaving ancient wisdom with modern strategy, and always remember to answer the call.